Welcome to Episode 4 of Leap of Curiosity. I'm your host, Adam Cohen. In the previous episode, I introduced the ultimate paradox of humanity, the idea that unless we're mindful of their presence and careful to counteract their influence, our rational intelligence may be sabotaged by irrational cognitive and psychological biases. Inherited from our ancestors, these traits provided useful, survival-enhancing advantages once upon a time, when humans struggled daily in contexts alien to modern humans. We've escaped the wilderness, but the legacy of surviving our species' ancient trials and tribulations lives on in our brains. We traded the savannah for smartphones, but our minds still whisper in the old tongue, fear first, reason later, if ever. The objective basis for these claims lies at the intersection of evolutionary psychology, neuroscience, cognitive science, and behavioral economics. I'm comfortable relying on the expertise and voluminous work of scientists in these fields. I'll readily acknowledge any mistakes or overreaches people may detect in what I'm sharing here. That said, I'm not exactly going out on a limb. In fact, the real risk isn't in overstating the science, it's in understating how thoroughly we're all entangled in these mental snares, educated or not, left or right, devout or skeptical. My main concern is twofold. These well-established biases increase the likelihood of people thinking and behaving incoherently. The current level of awareness of this problem is insufficient to elicit a concerted, deliberate effort to counteract it, at least on a societal level. Which means it's up to us, it's up to individuals. We risk backsliding into pre-Enlightenment darkness when we permit ourselves to be apathetic or hostile toward logic and evidence as we attempt to solve problems. We can't resist these influences unless we get to know them. So let's get curious on purpose about our intelligence's strange and stubborn bedfellows. Here's what evolutionary psychologists have figured out. They've discovered that the human brain developed primarily by maximizing survival and reproduction, not by honing its ability to discern objective truth. For hundreds of thousands of years in primitive tribal environments, our ancestors complied with authority figures, conformed unthinkingly to avoid being excluded from tribes, which would have been just short of a death sentence 100,000 years ago. Chronically exposed to lethal perils and inscrutable phenomena, humans privileged negative assumptions about unknown things that might destroy them, and they made split-second, highly emotional, often fear-driven decisions to affirm their group belonging, cope with stress, and save their lives. Humans repeatedly accepted irrational and unverifiable narratives as explanations. These fact-free stories reduced their existential anxiety, and sharing stories and understandings with others also strengthened tribal loyalties. These narratives' psychological and social benefits were far more valuable to our ancestors than logic and evidence. It's annoying that the human mind did not evolve to think like a scientist does. In fact, it evolved to think like a survivor. Traits that helped early humans react quickly, stay safe, and stay bonded to their group were selected over thousands of generations. These traits gave rise to heuristics, mental shortcuts, that helped our ancestors survive the constant, merciless conditions of the wild. Most of us don't live in the wild any longer, but parts of our brain continue to operate as if we do. So, for example, we judge the likelihood of something being true by how easily things come to mind in support of it, not on evidence or probability. This is the so-called availability heuristic. Another way of putting this is that the easier something is to remember, the more real or urgent or righteous it feels. Con artists, media and marketers, and professional politicians use this heuristic to gain attention, win trust, and manipulate people. It developed as a so-called fast and frugal strategy for assessing risks. If you see somebody get bitten by a snake in the tall grass, it makes sense to avoid the tall grass. In the information age, our tendency to accept claims as true based on vivid, recent, emotionally charged messages instead of based on reason and evidence presents self-evident problems. Algorithms amplify what captures our attention, not what reflects reality. What grabs us may feel like common sense, but often it isn't. Unless we deliberately correct for it, we're all vulnerable to it. In-group and out-group biases were vital to our primitive ancestors. Early humans lived in small, tight-knit tribes. Australopithecines and Homo habilis and Homo erectus lived in groups of about 20 to 50 individuals based on comparisons with modern primates. While small mobile bands of that size were common among Homo sapiens, there's evidence suggesting that sometimes our ancestors gathered in larger seasonal assemblies for trade, mating, and rituals. According to British anthropologist Robin Dunbar, the average human has a cognitive limit on the number of stable, meaningful relationships they can maintain at about 150, the so-called Dunbar number. You've probably got hundreds of contacts in your phone, maybe thousands of so-called friends and social media contexts, but your brain's maximum inner circle hasn't changed in tens of thousands of years. This affects how we process decisions and how our society identifies and addresses problems. Not only were empathy and trust stronger within the group than outside of it, but different rules applied to out-group people. They could be killed without punishment or enslaved without moral compunction. Tribes also privileged their superstitions over the superstitions of others. Today, tribal biases lead people to prioritize loyalties over objective truth, perhaps to construe the victories of their political team as more consequential than the actual effects of their team's policies. In our hyperpolarized society, people are reverting to in-group, tribal approaches to conversations about our common problems. We're not just disagreeing anymore, we're declaring heresies. Politics has become theology, and rival opinions are excommunicated, not debated. This is a recipe for civil strife regardless of who is in power. The pendulum swings to farther extremes the longer this tribalism prevails, mainstreaming genuinely incoherent fringe thinking, while the sensible center of our country feels pressured to choose between increasingly abhorrent sides. So tribalism is definitely a problem, and we have biases within us that encourage it. Hyperactive agency detection refers to perceiving intentions behind events. It may have helped our ancestors avoid threats, make sense of extreme phenomena like hurricanes and mudslides, and might have helped some people rise to leadership roles in the tribe because of their apparent insights. Today, it represents a superstitious inclination, leading to credulity about nonsensical explanations or unproven public policy ideas, gullibility to the assertions of strong leaders, and it sets up people for all kinds of harmful self-deception and unscrupulous manipulation. It's tragic. Biases consistent with tribalism, mysticism, and authoritarianism were crucial parts of our evolutionary development. We're going to move on here to what neuroscientists have figured out. They've conducted studies showing that many cognitive biases arise from automatic, unconscious brain activity, often involving the amygdala, limbic system, and prefrontal cortex. Our brain evolved in layers. Older, more reactive emotional systems coexist with our newer, more rational neural hardware. We're wired to protect our beliefs, not test them, so we often mistake subjective agreement for objective evidence. We're also wired to want to keep believing our beliefs, even after we encounter evidence to the contrary. Our brains still think it's better to mistake a stick for a snake than a snake for a stick. This leads people to believe danger and problems lurk in ambiguity, in uncertainty, even in scientific humility. People prefer unequivocal statements, and we cling tightly to what we have, even if letting go might lead to something better. Experimenters have discovered that humans feel the pain of loss more intensely than they feel the pleasure of an equivalent gain. Losing $100 hurts more than gaining $100 feels good. And now there are studies involving functional magnetic resonance imaging, electroencephalography, and magnetoencephalography, demonstrating that confirmation bias, threat detection bias, framing effects, and loss aversion bias consistently activate older, survival-linked subcortical brain areas. For example, fMRI and EEG studies consistently show confirmation bias lights up reward circuitry, but not reasoning regions. So much for the Enlightenment. Our brains throw a party every time they hear what they already believe. Truth is optional, dopamine is not. The fact that humans get dopamine hits for reassurance of beliefs without engaging our rationality should give us all pause. What feels good isn't necessarily good for us. Behavioral scientists have figured out some amazing things. Behavioral economists like Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky documented consistent, replicable patterns in human reasoning that deviate from logic and statistical norms. For example, humans tend to overvalue what we already own simply because it's ours, even if we didn't care about it before we had it. This is called the endowment effect. When a person reads an impeccably researched article proving their political hero lied, instead of considering the evidence, they attack the source, question the journalist's motives, and seek out friendlier takes. That's not objective reasoning, it's motivated reasoning. Motivated reasoning is what happens when your mind acts like a lawyer, building a case to win regardless of the facts, no matter what the truth is. It isn't difficult to imagine a scenario in which motivated reasoning combined with in-group biases would lead a person to believe that when their group performs well, they're winning, when objectively speaking, the leaders of the group they're loyal to are winning, while their situation is either unchanged or worsening. The chart President Trump presented on April 2, 2025, when making his case for reciprocal tariffs, was brazenly misleading. For example, regarding his decision to impose a 39% reciprocal tariff on the EU, how did he arrive at that number? According to factcheck.org, quote, in 2024, the U.S. goods trade deficit with the EU was $235.6 billion. That year, the U.S. imported $605.8 billion worth of goods from the EU. So $235.6 billion divided by $605.8 billion is 38.9%. This is universally acknowledged as an illegitimate way to calculate reciprocal tariffs. However, it's a powerful demonstration of how professional politicians leverage our biases in their messaging to prioritize their agendas at the expense of objective truth. Here are two biases that are quite alike, but there's a subtle difference between them. Humans prefer things to stay the same, even when evidence and logic show that change would likely be better. They also tend to assume that things will continue as they always have, even in the face of clear signs that they won't. This is why people fail to evacuate when man-made or natural disasters loom. So imagine you're on a slowly sinking ship. If you stay put, not because you'd like to, but because you can't quite believe the threat of change is real, that's normalcy bias. It's the attitude summed up by the idea, this can't really be happening. If you stick with the familiar rather than risk an unfamiliar solution, like getting on those lifeboats, you're subject to the status quo bias. You're thinking, even if this is really happening, I'd rather stay with what I know. We also tend to respond differently to the same information depending on how it's presented, especially when it's framed as a gain or loss. So, for example, we'll respond enthusiastically to a medical treatment that's 90% effective, but fear one with a 10% failure rate, even though they're the same thing. This is called the framing effect. And there's something called the anchor bias, the tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive when making decisions. Professional politicians use the anchor bias all the time. They announce bolder policy details than they intend to implement, even when the policy itself is corrupt or flawed. When politicians follow up with a version that appears moderate relative to the original announcement, people are more supportive of it despite its problematic nature. All of these biases are well documented across cultures and contexts. They're measurable, predictable, and even resistant to conscious correction. Resistant but not immune. We know these biases are not insurmountable problems. Let's move on to what cognitive scientists have figured out. Evidently, not all of our cognitive tendencies are inherited in the same way we think of traits passed down through evolution. Some appear to be innate to being human. Developmental psychologists like Paul Bloom and Karen Wynn have shown that even infants, babies as young as 3 months, display a preference for helpful over harmful behavior. In a series of puppet show experiments, babies consistently favored the character that helped another up a hill and recoiled from the one that pushed them down. If we could test the babies of our Paleolithic ancestors, would they have the same results? Perhaps, probably. The reactions show up before language, before formal learning, before culture even has a chance to make a full impression. It would seem they're not learned, but instead, natural human responses. Our fight or flight response is so ingrained, it often overrides rational decision-making in non-life-threatening contexts like family arguments, social disagreements, and moral dilemmas. Across the globe, cross-cultural studies confirm that we have moral intuitions and cognitive patterns like fairness, in-group preferences, and risk aversion that aren't exclusive to any one culture. Culture shapes them, but the template appears to be there from the start. Whether we favor reason or succumb to biases like those I've just described depends significantly on what our culture nurtures. Because of the Enlightenment, more of us are better prepared intellectually to resist the influence of these biases and their effects. At the same time, there is a powerful backlash against Enlightenment values loose in the world. In this moment, it would be ideal if parenting, education, entertainment, legal and political institutions would all effectively reinforce objectivity over comfort and the rigors of rational inquiry over reassuring beliefs. Given what we've learned about the coexistence of reason and these biases in our minds, that would be a coherent cultural response. Does that appear to you to be the direction our culture is moving in? Does it appear to be the case that authoritarian, tribal, and mystical biases are ascendant or in decline? Are many people in free societies throughout the world politely applauding as charlatans and strongmen rebrand irrationality as authenticity, irresponsibility as daring do, lack of curiosity as strength? Those are open-ended questions worth serious consideration in upcoming episodes. But I'll share now that I think that we can see troubling examples of authoritarian, tribal, and mystical biases being more influential in the world than they really ought to be at this point. And yet I would say people don't perceive incoherence as an issue, not the way they ought to. In my experience, people have an easier time recognizing the difficulties incoherence would pose to a hypothetical scientific endeavor. For example, if I asked you to imagine the struggles of a scientist whose tools fail to bring into focus basic facts about what he's studying, or who discovers facts but then fails to draw logical conclusions from them, then you would think he or she should stop wasting their time with those tools, and they should get their thinking in order, be more rational. But when that same incoherence shows up in our public policies, we defend it and dig deeper. How deep? By my reckoning, the multi-trillion-dollar sovereign debt of all the countries in the world is one symptom of it. Incoherence is not a hypothetical problem. By swamping our ability to reason objectively about morality, economics, politics, and public policy, incoherence paves a path to the high ground in these pivotal arenas for authoritarianism, tribalism, and mysticism to take hold. Its cost is steadily growing right in front of our eyes. Sooner than we think, its cost will be greater than our society will be able to bear. As of May 2025, The United States of America's annual interest payments on its national debt are closing in on $900 billion with a B dollars. Our normalcy bias is telling us this won't ever become more problematic than it already has. Monetization of the debt driving inflation, extravagant wasteful spending continuing largely unabated, but it won't get worse. History, of course, begs to differ. It's full of people who thought the fire they decided not to fight couldn't possibly reach their doorstep, up until the moment it did. That's an ominous note to end on, so I'll reiterate the good news. The Enlightenment happened. We know we can effectively counter these biases on a personal and societal level. In my next episode, I present my thoughts on how objectivity strikes back, and I offer a countermeasure for us all to try. Hopefully you'll find it useful as you strive to be more objective. Then I'll return to exploring the ultimate paradox of humanity from an historical perspective. Until next time, be curious on purpose, be curious on principle.